I'm going to go ahead and read Dr. Crowther's bio. So Professor Ed Crowther is a professor emeritus in history at Adams State University, where he taught from 1988 to 2018. He was department chair for 3 departments: HAPS for 20 years, teacher education for 6 years, and kinesiology for 2. And he served 4 terms as faculty senate president. He continues to work as a football coach for the Grizzlies and serves on the Adams State University Foundation Board, where he oversees its investments. A native of Vicksburg, Mississippi, he worked for Clan Watch Project and in the legal department for the Southern Poverty Law Center prior to coming to Adams State. Crowther holds a PhD in history from Auburn University and is the author or editor of 3 books, most recently The Enduring Lost Cause, and numerous articles and reviews. His publications include pieces on Dr. King and on Dr. King's best-known African-American foe, Reverend Joseph Harrison Jackson. So please welcome Dr. Crowther.
I have to think, I didn't think I'd ever be back in this position again, and I had to think as Heidi was introducing me, on the night before he was crucified, to use the words of the Reverend James Lawson, Dr. King was in room 306 of the Moraine Motel when he gets a call from Ralph David Abernathy, who would succeed King as the head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And Abernathy was at the Monument Temple, the Pentecostal African-American church in Memphis, and he said, "Martin, you got to get down here. The people want to see you." And so he hustles down to the Monument Temple, which was the largest African-American meeting house, church in Memphis, and Abernathy introduces him. And King, as was often his wont, as he gets up after the introduction, he says, I thought Abernathy was talking about somebody else. So thank you for the kind words, Professor Snyder. In the small world that we live in, which I really like, of course I had known Heidi since she was hired, but I got an email from her dad, who turns out is a football coach. And he wanted me to recruit a player, which we're doing. And then her son wants to be a football coach, and despite every effort by Coach Harrison and me to talk him out of it, I think he's going to go through with it. On the 15th of January 1929, a young man was born in Atlanta, Georgia by the name of Michael Lewis King. We'll come back to that. And he would go on to have a long career, which we will go through for people that maybe weren't alive at that time, which I guess is most of you. He had a long career and really became an icon in United States culture. And that's really kind of the departure point. We'll define culture wars for you. But virtually everyone in the United States, whether it's a favorable view or an unfavorable view, whether it's an accurate assessment based on what King actually said and did, or whether it's a gross misrepresentation or somewhere in between, virtually everyone in the United States has an opinion about Dr. King. He is a part of United States culture, and in a protean way. Right? And I will tell you, in my time in the Southern Poverty Law Center, the Klan very much they raised money off of opposing Dr. King, selling T-shirts, right, and disparaging Dr. King. And this is the trigger warning. I'm going to use not the N-word, but I'm going to use a word like that. The T-shirts described him as Martin Lucifer Coon. Welcome to my world, the world that I know so much about. And so Dr. King, very much part of the culture wars. And so when I thought about, thanks to Dr. Snyder's kind invitation, about how to approach Dr. King, who died in 1968, on April the 4th, it will be 53 years since Dr. King lost his life in front of the Lorraine Motel, in front of room 306 at the Lorraine Motel. 53 years. He only lived 39, right? We're coming up on the 100th anniversary of his martyrdom. And so I'm thinking about this notion of King as a character and sometimes caricature in United States culture. And of course, we're living in a time today. There's no way to sugarcoat it. We're living in a time today where the very identity of of the United States is under debate, and who gets to decide is under debate, and who gets to count as a United Statesian is under debate. That to me is the acme of the notion of culture war. So I picked some recent symbols. I mean, I don't have to tell you what these are, right? This is from 2021, right? Recently, shall we say, a demonstration at the United States Capitol. Don't worry, I'll get back to the truth later. And of course, this is from the summer of 2020, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. We had protests all over the country, most of them completely peaceful. But on occasion, people's emotions get the better of them, and you get this kind of thing. And so it's very, very clear to somebody like me, as we think about what it means to be a United Statesian and what the United States represents as a sovereignty, as a body of ideas and ideals, we're in an era of culture war. But I'm a historian, for good or for ill. And historians talk about, we use the nomenclature of continuity and change. And the guys that I publish with, along with Dr. Elizabeth Flowers, who considers herself one of the guys, they always laugh at me. They say, you always see continuity in everything. That's just what you do. And I guess I'm a one-trick pony. But this is the piece. The reality is Dr. King, during his life, lived in a time of culture war, where we're deciding what does it mean to be a United Statesian. When people who advocated for racial change today, they're woke. Back in my day, they were commies. Commies, right? And you know these images. This one's very famous, and this is an aspect of the way that Dr. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Congress of Racial Equality and the NAACP operated to draw attention to the plight of African Americans. You would have a demonstration, the goal of which was to force the other side to overreact, to force the other side to come out with their canines and their M1A1 police clubs. Do you know that there's a book of nomenclature for a police club? It has a thong, it has a grip, and it has a body. And in the nomenclature, it tells you to put your hand through the thong, grab the grip, and apply force to a human being. That's how we teach you. Later, sometimes, just do this on your own. Look up the term killology. This is something we do with first responders and police forces. We teach them to do things that are not very nice to people. King knew that not very nice people would do very ugly things. And of course, in Birmingham, in the spring of 1963, during Easter time, right, King is arrested. We'll talk about that in a minute. I'm sitting there with somebody I know to have been a member of the Students for a Democratic Society, and I hope this isn't too traumatic. But in 1968, the Democratic National Convention in Chicago essentially became a police riot because young people wanted change and older people wanted to kick their ass, and they did. You don't always pay attention to the full career of King, but after beginning his career in the former Confederate States of America, he took the aegis of his movement northward to encounter Jim Crow practices, particularly in the area of housing. And in August of 1966, King and his entourage, these people are actually protecting King. So you need to understand they are actually shielding him because he had just been knocked senseless by a rock. And a number of people were hurt in a counter demonstration to prevent Dr. King and people advocating for change in Chicago from marching from Marquette Park on the southwest side of Chicago to a realtor's office to demand that the realtor began to lease property on a racially non-discriminatory basis. And that act was so provocative to the melanin deficient community in Chicago that they hurled rocks and bottles, and King would later say, I had never seen anything this bad. I had never seen such hatred, even in Alabama. When you can top Alabama in the racial hatred category, you've done something, and it's not terribly nice. So I mentioned that we're going to talk about the notion of King in the age of culture wars, and the founder of culture war studies in the United States is a sociology professor at the University of Virginia, James Davison Hunter. Foolishly, years ago, I assigned this book to my U.S. history class. It wasn't a success. It was not a success. But here's the skinny on Hunter, and I like these ideas that help us grapple with complexity and nuance in ways that are manageable. And basically he says, look, there are two kinds of value systems and behaviors and belief systems in the United States, the progressive and the orthodox. And the progressives are those people that always believe that you can do better, that you can make change. The orthodox view says that the world is the way it is, and it probably reflects some sort of natural law. There are hierarchies: white men, white women, rich, middling, working class whites, and then everybody else. And that's just the way it is. And it would be foolish to try to interfere with the created order of things. They really, really believe this. And so when we think about if this idea has value, this debate informs everything from our politics to what we believe to be true about the United States and its history. Whether we think that we're all individuals in a post-racial society, or whether we believe that there are systems in place that favor some people over others. And sometimes those systems are defended, guarded with men with guns. The data is pretty clear on that piece. An idea that I wish I had done more with when I was teaching. Well, I failed at so many things, this would just be another example, but the notion of U.S. exceptionalism is this idea that the United States is different from every other country in the world. And I'm going to tell you unapologetically that part of the demonstration is absolutely true. Unlike other countries where there are blood ties and kinship ties, the United States is really a country based on ideas. But also, unlike countries where we have common language and kinship, there was never really a hereditary aristocracy in the United States. Nothing like what they had under the Ancien Regime in France, right? Nothing like that. That was for you, Dr. Sines. And so the idea that the United States is a different place and a better place, okay, and then the notion is the idea is really perfect and you shouldn't mess with it. We've got this Constitution, don't try to change it. It was perfect as it was handed down literally in 1787. That's where it starts to get a little murky because it wasn't handed down. It was hammered out in 3 months in a hot place, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, before air conditioning. Those are the facts and they are not in dispute. And so in Martin Luther King Jr.'s time, debating about American exceptionalism as we're doing battle with the godless communists in the Cold War, I will tell you this just to throw out there, but for the Cold War, I don't know that we would ever have had anything like the Civil Rights Movement. The United States government and important opinion makers really were competing for the support of newly decolonized countries in Africa and Asia in the General Assembly of the United Nations. And that's why they realized you can't lecture Russia about human rights when you operate Mississippi at home. You just can't do it. And so here's the notion, right? Whether we're talking about King's time or the time today, right? When we look at social problems, right? We define them in the language of culture wars. My side is right, therefore your side is wrong. My side is better than your side because I have the revealed truth, and obviously if you disagree with me, you do not. It makes for tough sledding. A lot of people, for very good reasons, they know something about Dr. King. There's been a King holiday now. This is the 30th anniversary. The legislation was signed after King's holiday, but in 1983, President Reagan signed into law the legislation creating the King holiday, right? So that's a long time ago. But everybody knows, well, King is this guy. He's big, he's famous, he's got streets named after him and schools and all of that. But a lot of people don't have the luxury of studying his life or knowing much about it. So King was born in Atlanta, Georgia, and at the age of 16, he went to Morehouse College, where his father had gone to school. And he majored in sociology. And it was a professor there, George Dennis Sale Kelsey, who convinced King that you could be a minister of the gospel and not be a moron. King went there to study medicine. That's what he did. He went there to study medicine. And it was Kelsey that said, you want to do good, you can do good through the institution of the church just as well as you can do good in an emergency room or in an operating room. King would matriculate from Morehouse, go on to Crowther Theological Seminary to get a Bachelor of Divinity degree. This is a seminary in Chester, New York. And then he proceeded on to Boston University, where he earned a PhD. And fascinating career. And one of the things about King, you think about this, he is a highly, highly educated person. And in our culture war environment, we sometimes denigrate education. I don't know how many times people have said to me, well, you ain't got no common sense, Mr. PhD. And I sure hope my intelligence is not common. I really hope I do better than that. But the flip side, I don't know how many times I've sat in academic meetings and had my colleagues say, well, you know, these athletes, they shouldn't even be here. And then, oh, we don't mean you. So, well, you know, who do you mean? And so, you know, we're all a little bit guilty. But let me say this about educated people and the human history. Educated people have done some pretty important things. Not everything good, but some pretty important things, right? Martin Luther King is named after Martin Luther, who had a PhD. And all he did as a professor was revolutionize biblical hermeneutics, how you read the Bible, soteriology, how you understand the process, the mechanics of salvation, and ecclesiology, right? We got Protestantism. And as I would say when I was committing academic malpractice all those years ago, in many, many ways, what we think of as the Reformation began because a college professor was doing his homework. I can think of another professor, more complex, right? But Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer, on the faculty at Caltech, they just identified the neutron in 1933, and between 1943, a decade, and 1945, a dozen years, they turned atomic theory into a deliverable. Ambiguous legacy, but if it wasn't for the atomic bomb, my father would have died in what's called Operation Olympic in World War II. If the Japanese don't surrender, he was a field telephone operator. They come off the bow of a Higgins boat with 2 spools of wire, and you run until you get shot. And then there's a backup who picks up the spools and finish the job, because you have to set up communication to direct ship-to-shore bombardment, the way we fought warfare in those days. And so the fact that King is a professor informed, or an educated man, informs a great deal of what he does. It makes him able, as an educated person, to talk to moneyed interests in New York City, and as a compassionate person to talk to ordinary people who till the soil and wanted a better life for themselves in places like Alabama. The area where I have some claim of expertise on Dr. King is in his early years, as he is defining himself as a person, and events overtook him. King was finishing his dissertation when he turned down a pastorate in Detroit. The assumption was he was going to go to Atlanta and take over for his father at Ebenezer Baptist Church. He chose to go to Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, now Dexter Avenue King Memorial Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. And while he's there, he does all of these really cool preacher things. He organizes committees, including a political action committee. And the chairwoman of that committee was Mary Fair Burke, who's on the faculty at Alabama State University. She and a work study did the legwork for the initial phase of the Montgomery bus boycott. You have to duplicate on a ditto master and get the word out. And she had to be very careful about using state property to do this, because the white establishment would have shut Alabama State down. But here's Mary Fair Burke, right? When the Montgomery bus boycott was effective on its first day, they have a meeting in Montgomery, and Dr. King winds up becoming the leader of the organizational expression of the bus boycott, the Montgomery Improvement Association. He's 26 years old. And this is the part that fascinates me. I have handled every single piece of paper that we have of King's, from the time he left Boston University to the time of the Montgomery bus boycott. And he used to write his sermons out in longhand, and then they would be typed up and he would deliver them. As a result of his role in Montgomery with the boycott, he becomes so busy that typically his sermons are borrowed. They're never typed out. He's not around to do this kind of work. And so the point is, the kind of person he trained to be evolved into the kind of person that you know, right? He became something else of necessity. And he became a national figure because of the Montgomery bus boycott. And I've done that in this very room before. Let me tell you a little bit about Mrs. Parks. She worked for the NAACP investigating sexual assaults perpetrated by white men against black women. That's what she did. The book to read is Danielle McGuire at the Dark End of the Street. And that book did better, but people were traumatized. They said, I can't believe this. I said, well, and you don't know the half of it. It's really worse. She couldn't get all the bad stuff in. But when Rosa Parks was leaving downtown Montgomery, where she worked as a seamstress, and she boards the Cleveland Avenue bus. Cleveland Avenue goes southwest in Montgomery to a part of town where people like me never go. And so in Montgomery, they had a floating seat ordinance. Whites sit from front to back, blacks sit from the back to the front, and you have to maintain a vacant row. That's why it's a floating seat audience. She was seated on the aisle when a white person came and took a seat in the vacant row, which means the 4 seats behind have to now become vacant and to maintain the floating seat. She was sitting on the aisle. The other 3 gentlemen get up and go to the back. She moves from the aisle to the window. And so the notion of this demure seamstress, she knew exactly what she was doing. She had had enough. You know, as Mrs. Hamer would later say, I am sick and tired of being sick and tired. And Mrs. Hamer knew a little bit about things. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference evolved out of the bus boycott movement. It's a ministerial alliance, a group of preachers who collaborate to use different tactics in order to improve conditions. And it was under the SCLC aegis that most of Dr. King's work would occur. Many of you have read this, the piece of writing that made Dr. King a literary figure, Letter from Birmingham City Jail. He was asked by the best white people Alabama had. These were the good guys. Dr. King, why are you in Birmingham stirring up trouble? And you know what he said? I came here to Birmingham because injustice is in Birmingham. And injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Yeah, that's where that one came from. This was in April. This is in August. And so King goes with a number of civil rights leaders to Washington, D.C., to the March for Jobs and Justice. And he gives the most famous address that he ever gave. And sadly, we remember about the last 2 minutes of an 18-minute, 34-second address. I have a dream, right? And we forget how it ended. I have a dream that one day black men and white men and Jews and Gentiles will join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. One of the things that's lost, particularly from a white perspective, looking at the movement, we think about African Americans wanting to do stuff for themselves. That's not what King was about. You see, if black people could help white people get beyond racism, not only would black people be unshackled, unfettered from Jim Crow, but white people could be unfettered from the hatred used to maintain Jim Crow. Sometime, read James Baldwin, who will tell white readers a lot about the self-hatred white people must have in order to do what they do. And so it wasn't just cashing a check for African American equality in the 100-year anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. That was a kind of liberty that was on the table, that was being sought after, but it was also liberty for everybody, right? Kind of a cool thing. Because of his career to this point, he wins the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. In 1965, King had been working with Lyndon Baines Johnson over a voting rights bill, and Lyndon was really, really clear. We can't do this. And so African Americans marched across the Alabama River on the Edmund Pettus Bridge down Highway 80, which was later named the Walter Gavan Highway. Walter Gavan was head of the White Citizens Council in Alabama, and I had a person look at me straight up and say, oh, that wasn't intentional. I won't tell you what I thought under my breath. It isn't appropriate. Colonel Al Lingo and the Alabama Department of Public Safety beat those marchers nearly to death. The late Congressman John Lewis nearly died that day. Amazing. So King goes to Selma, and they have a second march. And this time, because can you imagine what it looked like in the Soviet Union, the newsreel footage for this event, right? white people beating black people, right? You think about the propaganda value to the Soviet Union. After the Selma to Montgomery March in August, Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act, a monumental piece of legislation, significant piece of legislation, unfortunately crippled by the Supreme Court decision Shelby v. Holder in 2013. Just one of those things. Right after the Voting Rights Act was passed, the Watts riots broke out. And while the white backlash against social change was ongoing, this becomes a watershed moment where the white support for the Civil Rights Coalition begins to attrit. King goes north, tries to work with activists in Chicago on a variety of things, but especially housing and police on black violence, but especially housing. And he and Mrs. King lived in an African-American part of town in what white people would think of as a slum, right? And what you began to see and what King began to experience is how challenging racial change, racial justice really is. Because when things are habit and not necessarily codified directly into law, they're hard to target. It's hard to change what's inside of people. We began to see, this is my favorite King speech, by the way, Riverside Church. Riverside Church was built by the Rockefellers to keep Harry Emerson Fosdick in New York City as a preacher. And it is like the Lincoln Memorial, it's a place of huge symbolic value. In this Riverside Church address, King began to target what he had come to see as the twin evils in the United States that drove everything: racism at home and imperialism abroad. This is during the height of the Vietnam War. It's here where he says that the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. You can imagine that a lot of people did not want to hear that. The favorite part of his career is when King goes to Memphis in support of the American Association of State, County, and Municipal Employees, local number 1733. Two African-American garbage workers had taken refuge from a rainstorm in the back of their disrepair trash compactor truck, and the compactor killed them. Their benefits were not adequate to pay the funeral. And the garbage workers went on strike. Mayor Henry Loeb, who would make me look like a dwarf, he stood 6'8". He had a degree with distinction from Brown University, so the notion that the people who are pushing back against social change are ignorant is not really true. He also kept a shotgun under his desk, loaded, ready to go with the plug pulled, right? So he's got 5 shots, right? Henry Loeb said, "We're not giving an inch." King tried very hard to have a nonviolent demonstration to highlight conditions. There was a police riot. Another time there was a huge snowstorm. We got out of school for 2 days. I remember that was just so cool. While King is planning the 3rd march, of course, the Hellhound is on his trail. James Earl Ray would purchase a Remington Game Master 30-06. And about 6 p.m., Dr. King would be shot in the face with a bullet that traveled 2,750 feet per second. It struck him in the cheek, passed down his spine, and almost exited, under the left pectoral muscle. He fell backward. The blood spatter looks like a cross, which is why James Lawson would always refer to King's martyrdom as a crucifixion. In the wake of King's death, Congress passed the last major civil rights legislation, the Fair Housing Act in 1968. And it's very much a half measure, so much of politics is. And after that, king becomes a symbol, and the movement really, really fragments at that point. This is one of my favorite pictures of King. He's 26 years old, almost 27, and he's talking to the leadership group of the Montgomery Improvement Association, right? And when you think about this, King becomes a public figure in December 1955, and he lives all the way only until 1968. I remember years ago, thanks to some grant writing efforts by Dr. Loosbrock, we were lucky enough to meet the Reverend Billy Kyles. Billy Kyles was picking King up for dinner at the point where King was killed. Billy Kyles was a preacher in Memphis, and he had been very active in civil rights activities in Memphis. Billy Kyles came here, and it was it was just a powerful presentation. And he talked about the tragedy of the death of Martin Luther King. Look at what he could have been. A university president, a UN ambassador, right? And instead, they put his body in a buckboard and move it down Auburn Avenue. That was on the 8th of April for his funeral. This is King probably at his prime. This is the time of the Nobel Peace Prize. And of course, this is the funeral at Ebenezer Baptist Church in April of 1968. When I went to interview for my first job at the first academic job at the ripe old age of 24, I'm sitting at lunch with the hiring committee, trying to make sure I don't spill food on myself and do other kinds of faux pas that can cost you a job. And I was asked by the chair of the search committee, a woman from Tickfaw, Louisiana, that's near Baton Rouge. She said, well, Dr. King was a communist, wasn't he? And I said, well, Bayard Rustin, yeah, but Stanley Levinson, maybe, but no, not Dr. King. And she wasn't having any of it. And later, when I came to Adams State, I had a woman in my office wanting to write on Dr. King as the exemplar of anarchy. And I knew so much about his writings that wasn't going to fly, but she was certain that she knew and I didn't know much of anything. I think it's really important to give King his due. How does King see himself? And it is really, 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 really clear that he saw himself as a preacher, as a minister of the gospel. He said this over and over again, and he lived his life as if this were true, so there must be something to it. And this is the most famous quote, but this is when King is in Chicago. And, he says, look, I know I do civil rights work, but I do it because I'm trying to serve God by serving people. That's why I do what I do. And so to understand King, however else you want to extrapolate, I suggest taking him seriously about how he saw himself. And it's over and over and over in his writings, and it actually helps to inform how he thought about his work in affecting social change for economic justice, legal equality in the United States. And I love this. He says, I'm a preacher, but I came from a preacher family where everybody loved everybody. And it reminded me, as I think about the tactic of nonviolence, how we go about it. Those of you that were fortunate enough not to have to take Greek as your undergraduate language may or may not know that in the Greek language there are multiple words for love. Just like, the Inuit have all these words for snow. They have words for love. So many of you, if you're a psychology major, you know this. Eros, sensual love, right? Sexual love, juxtaposed often with against thanatos. There's something called storge, which is familial love. But if you're a student of Koine Greek and you read the New Testament in Greek, you're going to encounter two words that are often in tension, right? Phileo, right, which is brotherly love. It's like on a football team, right? In the huddle, right? You sweat with these guys. You have each other's back. You'll give your life. You'll give a body part for your brother, right? But that's not the highest kind of love. Agape, that's what King identified with. It's a selfless, sacrificial kind of love where you love those that don't deserve it. And you're willing to sacrifice for the good of other people. I wonder where that would sit in a class on the virtues of capitalism. Thanks to Dr. Snyder, because I'm privileged to give lots and lots of King talks, and you can do so much because there's so much to work with. But she likes the collection of King's sermons that was published early in the 1960s called Strength to Love. And so I wanted to highlight what I think is one of King. He's got two favorite sermons. We'll get to the other one. But the things he preaches over and over again. And this really informs the notion of what nonviolent resistance in the movement was all about, right? Why you need to love other people. Part of it is so you don't become toxic yourself. But this notion that King had, redemptive, that maybe you could love enough so somebody who is so burdened with self-hatred could begin to love themselves and then begin to love others. That was the possibility of redemption, right? That's what agape really, really means in the context of social Christianity. And so the fascinating thing is when we often think about community organizing, we think in practical, strategic terms. We count votes. We draft legislation. And we say, we're going to march nonviolently, right, to prove our point. And we forget that maybe King's approach at an ethical level operated on an even higher plane. I'm going to be the best that I can. I'm going to sacrifice the most that I can, not for my sake only, but for the sake of others. And so, why do you love? And it's fascinating because he's borrowing, from the Son of Man when he says, you've heard it said, it's in the Torah. Love your friends and hate your enemies. Hate them. But I say, love your enemies and bless those who despitefully use you for my sake. It's a very different ethic. And I suspect a very unpopular ethic. I don't know how well King wears in some circles once you begin to study him. I really think that we do Dr. King a disservice when we realize he's talking about changing the world through the power of agape love, and we say, well, what an airheaded idealist he must have been. Dr. King did not have the luxury of idealism. He lived, born in 1929, lived through the Depression, lived through World War II. He begins his collection of sermons while he's in jail, and they say Albany, not Albany in Georgia, it's Albany, Georgia. He's in jail. Sheriff Laurie Pritchett's got him locked up. King was arrested 30 times, jailed 29 times. You don't have to lecture Dr. King about the vicissitudes of the carceral state. He lived in it. So when he is talking about his ideas of transforming the human heart, he knows a whole lot about how much the heart needs to be transformed. I've written earlier about the 3 conversions of Dr. Martin Luther King. His first conversion is when George Kelsey says, "You can be a preacher." His second conversion comes when he's at Boston University, and he begins to reflect on this philosophy of personalism, and he begins to kind of have a deeper theological understanding. But in January of 1956, at his house, the parsonage for Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, 315 South Jackson Avenue in Montgomery, you can go visit it, he gets a phone call. This is what they say. When he hangs up the phone, a bomb goes off under the back bedroom in the house. Mrs. King and Yolanda are in that room. They easily could have been killed. And that night, Dr. King sat at the coffee pot trying to put himself back together. And he says, I heard a voice, "Martin, stand up for justice, stand up for truth, stand up for righteousness, and lo, I will be with you until the end of the age." And that was his third conversion. It's a powerful thing. Here's a man who knows that people want him dead for what he's doing, for living out his sense of what was right and what was just, and in his case, what he believed to be the truth of Christianity. Dr. Loosbrock and I talk about this all the time. There are so many aspects of United States history that are incompletely understood and sometimes deliberately misunderstood. World War II is a big topic. And there's a lot of unity in the United States to defeat the Japanese, because after all, those sneak attacking people had bombed Pearl Harbor. There's a lot less support for the war in Europe. And there are a number of people in the military who say if going to war against Hitler means we'd undo Jim Crow at home, I hope the Nazis win. The greatest generation in the good war. You see, the mythology's incomplete, right? And I'm going to show you something, and this has 2 T's in it. I just saw that, 2 T's. Professor at Dartmouth University has written one of the most useful, wonderful books on African American experience in World War II. See, there's white history and then there's history for everybody else. And so white people are fighting, oh, we're going to beat the Japanese, and I wonder about Germany. Black people see World War II as an opportunity to win victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home. We call it the double V. And black newspapers, I'll show you one, are full of this kind of language. Dr. King, naive dreamer, he's going to give a speech. He's a student at Booker T. Washington High School in Atlanta. He's got to take a bus to give a speech on citizenship. And he's sitting in his bus seat, and he's told to get up and get out, you know, because a white guy's got to sit here. And so this is one of his early statements. Here you are, an honor student, but you're still black in the United States, and you don't have rights that the white man is bound to respect. And so when Dr. King postulates ideas about affecting change, his postulation is grounded in the bitter reality of the world in which he lived. This isn't in your history book. It's not. In the fall of 1945, Alan Leftridge and Frank Glenn, on their military base right out, this is near Normandy, so north of Paris, they go to the Red Cross station and they want to get a donut, because that's what they do at the Red Cross. They pour coffee and they serve donuts. Here's the problem. There were white women there. So they were ordered to leave. Now, what happened next? There, different perspectives. They were shot and killed. Right? These are unarmed men shot and killed for the crime of asking for a donut while white people are present, white women. A term I bet you didn't have in your book growing up, but I knew this word when I was real small. My grandfather was a veteran of World War I, and after World War I in the South, when the black troops came home, there was a term that informed the white imagination. French woman ruined. And the notion was these black folk had been in Europe and their good Southern morals had been corrupted. And so there's this fear around controlling access of black bodies to white female bodies that leads to this kind of stuff. It's a fascinating kind of thing. And so the Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender, there's scores of African American newspapers that today, thankfully, due to the internet, are available online. And you can read all about how black people recorded their lived experiences in the United States. Since Dr. King was alive and practicing, and since his death, there's been a tendency to kind of make him palatable to everybody. And so, even in Strength to Love, there are passages from King's sermons that were stricken because they might make white people feel uncomfortable. Because apparently white people struggle with discomfort. I don't know. Professor Cornel West coined this term, the Santa Clausification of Martin Luther King. He uses the term, we deodorize Dr. King. We make him non-controversial. By the time King was ending his public career involuntarily, he's talking about redistribution programs, redistributing wealth. Yeah. So we certainly can't have that in a lesson plan, just one of those things. This is probably the thing that I see the most of today. So, in King's I Have a Dream speech, he's very, very famous. It's often quoted as Dr. King wanted to live in a world where people were judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Now, there are a couple of things wrong with that quote. One, it's completely out of context. But that's not what he said. I have a dream that one day my little children will live in a world where they're not judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. You see, my little children, that's not a problem for them because they don't have melanin. There's an interesting talk, one of my favorite King talks, not the Stanford version, it's the same talk, but the one that he gave at Grosse Pointe, Michigan, where he goes down and he says, look, take out Roget's thesaurus and look at all the words that go with white, pure, unblemished. All the words that go with black, right? Dastardly, diabolical, right? So he knows what he's saying in the I Have a Dream speech, and it's not this. It's not this. And this was yesterday. This was yesterday. I don't know that it's even a point worth making, but back when I was teaching, I would always want to have, as we got in 203 up to the present time, current stuff. And I would put on my PowerPoint slides a note to me. Look up, right? In 2017, it said, look up police on black violence. That was the morning after Stephon Carter was murdered by police for the crime of wielding a cell phone. So in January, I could write myself a note and know that when I got time to teach the class, there would be something hot off the press to talk about. I could guarantee it. So I had a placeholder. I won't tell you, I wasn't necessarily trolling Ted Cruz, but I did have the kind of characters you type when you want to cuss, but you're not cussing. I said, check to see what some says on MLK Day. It took a minute. It took 1 minute. because we do this all the time, because we want MLK to be safe for white people. And so we end up getting him wrong. So I love the Common Core for all of its problems. But here's a challenge. When I do a Common Core assignment, I say, here's the text. Read it. Now, I'm a big believer in reading the text. I often criticize people for saying, I want to think outside the box. I want you to think first inside the box. So let's read the text. But when you ignore the context, you get King wrong. And obviously, there's something hidden there that's going to jump out and appear. Today, we don't like diversity, equity, inclusion training. We think it's bad because guess what? It makes me uncomfortable. It really does. As I sit there in my, privilege, I don't want to be bothered with all this stuff. And besides, it was before I was born, And so this is the big thing now. Critical race theory. And this, I love this. Stop, and it says it's stop weaponizing our kids and employees. Woke is an acronym, right? But the idea is wokeness is bad. Wokeness is bad. And it's like, how are you supposed to know how the world is if you refuse to grapple with it? If you teach history, there's some good things. Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Sonnets from the Portuguese, these are good things. But then there's the Holocaust, and there's the massacre at My Lai 4, and there's the third assault at Cold Harbor. There's a lot of stuff that should make an intelligent, empathic, compassionate person a little uncomfortable. Maybe uncomfortable enough to maybe try to affect some change. Dr. King talked about this in his speech at Drew University. He wanted to create an agency of constructive discomfort in order to make things better for people. This is the other thing that happens, and this is the sort of giant stew pot of American history. Let's just put every name in there. Dr. King was a hero just like George Washington. Well, Jefferson and King, let's see, Jefferson enslaved his own descendants, and King was trying to end the practical enslavement of black people. But we put them all in there, and then we said, well, I'm not racist. The flip side of that is that King still lives in the minds, hearts, and attitudes of a lot of people who are trying to do good things. And so I learned from Dr. Uhura Williams, who wrote a really cool book called Rethinking the Freedom Struggle. We brought him here to Adams State. And as a white person and a historian who trained a long time ago, I didn't know anything about hip hop, and I didn't know anything about mural art. And he's got a chapter in his book on hip hop and mural art and the freedom struggle. And I go, wow, that's cool. And then I got to ride all the way up to Denver and the airport, to the airport, and we were talking about this. But so this is one in Chicago where we see Dr. King with a lot of Chicago people who've been part of the movement. So here is our huddle. Here is our fraternity. Here's our sorority of people fighting for emancipation in Chicago. As soon as the George Floyd in May of 2000, as soon as the George Floyd thing was out on the news, murals sprung up all over the country. And they included Dr. King, and often juxtaposed. You'll see pictures, rest in power, and the image of George Floyd who was murdered, and the image of Dr. King who was murdered. And so for black people, this is a way of connecting the horrific present with an equally horrific past. And not just black folk do this. This is near Latino Market in Los Angeles. And so here we have the Virgin of Guadalupe with Dr. King. Right? Because in that context, right, our identity as people struggling to be good and to do good is defined in part this way, and we incorporate the words, actions, and ideas of Dr. King. It's just one of those things. So the sort of Crowtherian thing, we think about King and he's teaching us all nonviolence. Well, nonviolence is a tactic to get here. And at no point was Dr. King just about legal equality. It was legal equality, economic equality, social equality. It was the panoply of things and a myriad of proposals for how to get there. But instead, a lot of times, we'll get, King actually said this. King said this. It is a fact. In the age of YouTube, you can hear him say this. And so if I take these words, it's like, well, maybe we don't need government. But this is what he actually said. And this is a way of thinking about, if you think about the number of characters, that would make a tweet, and this is just in a paragraph, right? And he's actually calling for legislation. You see Dr. King coming of age in World War II, living through being jailed and threatened with violence and all that. He knows full well the limitations of what you can do with a law. It's not going to change his heart, but it may keep him from putting a rope around my neck. Right? He understands the limits as well as the possibilities. And so I think that's kind of a cool thing. I want to give credit to Heather Cox Richardson for this. I was fumbling because, when you talk about Dr. King, and if you're a historian, it just sounds like wrath after wrath after wrath. This bad thing happened, and then this bad thing happened. And that's to miss the point, right? Life is hard, life is tough, right? But here we are, right? What we call the fierce urgency of now. That's from the Riverside Address, Beyond Vietnam. But the night before he was killed, Dr. King called out, goes to the Monument Temple, and he gives it's a beautiful address, and he is so exhausted. If you watch at the end of the address as he turns to his seat, he collapses and has to be caught because he's completely spent. But he begins the address. He's talking. So the Monument Church, the Pentecostal church, is where the poor black people went, right? Dr. King, Dexter Avenue, that's where the Alabama State educated faculty went. So he's talking to people that during this strike, they need to be lifted up. And he said, if I could ask God to live at any time, he's an educated man. He starts with Egypt. But I wouldn't want to live there. And then he rolls through the Roman Empire. I wouldn't want to live there. Then he rolls through the Renaissance. I wouldn't want to live there. He goes to the 19th century and talks about abolition, and I wouldn't want to live there. I'd want to say, I want to live right now. I want to live in 1968. I want to be doing what we're doing now. For all the terrors and all the travail, I want to be doing it now. It's 1968. In William Manchester's massive book, The Glory and the Dream, it's got a chapter on 1968. It's called 1968, the year everything went wrong. So this is the Tet Offensive. This is MLK being assassinated. This is Robert Francis Kennedy being assassinated. I was there, it sucked. 1968 was a very bad year, and yet there's something really powerful when King says, I'd want to live right now. So in his time, he says, look, the best part of right now, the fierce urgency of now, are people are saying, we're not going to do this colonialism anymore. We want to be free. We want to be free in Africa. We want to be free here, where apparently getting potable drinking water continues to be a challenge. And then he says, and this is the point, the fierce urgency of now. There are always problems. Before you came here, Mr. President, we worried about state funding levels. I bet you worried about that some this morning. But the problem is, the problems are perennial, but the opportunity is to grapple with them and, where possible, to make changes, right? And we have a lot of stuff on our table today. He loves this line. Originally, this was in the Riverside Church address. The choice is not between violence and nonviolence. The choice is between nonviolence and non-existence, which had a lot of resonance during the Cold War, right? And so we live in a time where there are all kinds of issues. Gender equality, economic inequality, climate, all kinds of challenges. And his idea was, hey, what's wrong with the present, right? That's when we get to grapple with change. And that's when we get to apply the ethic of loving enemies in order to promote good. I've got one more thing, but I want to tell you about this. Instead of printing out, like we used to, I've got these QR codes. The QR code will take you to a bibliography I put together of King's writings and speeches and books about King, and I even took wrote a little bit about the difference between history as historians do it, and memory and heritage and all of that, because it's kind of cool. The best way to understand King is to read and study Dr. King. This is it. I did this intentionally. So the best way to honor Dr. King, and you're going to do this on a service day, right? That is the coolest thing. But I selected this, I picked this word deliberately. Other than loving your enemies, Dr. King's other favorite sermon is from Luke chapter 10. And those of you that grew up in church would know this as the story of the Good Samaritan. That's an okay characterization. I like to think of it as a master teacher turning the tables on an insolent student. Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? He says, well, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Okay, who is my neighbor? So the Son of Man doesn't say, here's the answer to the question. He tells a story, a parable, something cast alongside, parabole, to illustrate a point. And he tells a story about a man who fell among thieves. He got his butt kicked, his possessions taken, he's lying on the side of the road. And the priest and the Levite go by and go, it's a shame how the human condition. And it was the Samaritan. And so Samaritans would be like African Americans today. Samaritans in Jewish culture are despised outside the magic circle. It's the Samaritan who takes care of the man who fell among thieves and takes him to an inn and pays a bill and says, if there's any more that I owe you, I'll settle them up. So he asks, who is the neighbor? Oh, the one that helped the person in need. You see, that's the point. Neighbor is not a relationship. It's not a noun, it's an action. It's an action. When there is a need, meet that need the best you can. So that's what Dr. King's teaching was all about. And I love these. These essentially say the same thing. Robert Parris Moses had his 79th birthday here at Adams State University, and sadly Bob died a while back, but a long and productive life. His thing was that everybody, even somebody with a broken bone, can do what they can do. You don't have to win the Nobel Peace Prize. You can volunteer at a soup kitchen. You can be kind to every person you meet. You may donate money. There are a lot of ways to do it. But just by doing, you're making a difference. And of course, more famously, Robert Francis Kennedy, just before he was killed, and he talked about this notion that a little action by a lot of people can transform even the ugliest of situations. And of course, Gandhi says it his way, right? Be the change you wish to see in the world. This is another of my favorite King quotes. You see, he said at the Monument Temple, he said, I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get there together, right? He can't even see the end point. And so you make the effort, even when you don't know where it's going to end up. So, Dr. King, I wish it were more than a one-day kind of thing. And I think the challenge of Dr. King's life and the challenge of how he lived his life is that being the neighbor is something that we can do every single day. I want to thank you for your time and incredible patience as a long-winded old codger who talks about something that is passionate about. I'm happy to take questions if you have them. I'll try to make up something that's at least defensible. And otherwise, participate with Dr. Snyder this week and do her thing.
Anybody have any questions?
Yes.
Yeah, this is probably the most ridiculous thing to be asking about, but you mentioned he was born Michael.
Oh, I forgot to come back. So in 1934, Dr. King's father, Daddy King, went to Universität Heidelberg in Germany. Imagine, 1930. Hitler's been in power about a year. He was so taken with the career of Martin Luther that he came back and changed his name and his son's name. And so you'll see this, that people that know Dr. King from the Atlanta period will often call him Mike. And so in his inner circle, there were people that called him Mike. And so it's a fascinating thing. How important was Martin Luther? He was important enough for Martin Luther King to come into being from Michael Lewis King. So thank you for that. Appreciate that. Okay, cool. You guys, thank you. Go home.